Verbal or chat confirmation will do for both teams. Hello, sorry, just confirming. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so government and op, are you here and sorry, let me just check my. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna assume that both teams are here and complete. Since this is the out rounds, I won't ask for your speaker positions anymore. But yeah. So good day. Welcome to the out rounds for Intertext Pre-UADC. I am your chair, Monty, but it's Annika Monterola on top. But feel free to call me Monty. Paneling with me is you may introduce yourself. Let's start with Aryan.
Hi guys, Aryan here, panel for the round. All the best.
And sorry, I'm not sure if I'm gonna pronounce this correctly. Sudiksha, if you're here, may you introduce yourself? Or I don't see them in the Zoom. Wait, okay. I'm gonna assume that they're not here yet. So we can wait for a bit. But yeah. Before we start, just so that it's a clear like flow throughout the round, may I ask anyone from Gov and Op to say the speaker order and your POI preferences so that it's just clear from everyone. Oh, okay. The other panelist is here as well. So for Op, okay, thank you for that. So yeah. If Gov can do the same, kindly do so as well. And while we're waiting, oh wait, no, wait, they're not okay, sorry. I don't think my other panel is here yet. Just informing OC and Cap. I think Sudiksha's not yet here. So yes. Okay. Thank you, government and op, for your speaker positions. So yeah. Congratulations for reaching the semifinals of Intertext Pre-UADC. And to begin the round, let's now call on the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
Wait, is the panelist here?
Oh, I'm not sure. Wait, I can like mention them via WhatsApp, but I don't think
We'll
they're.
wait 1 minute. We'll take 2 minutes. One more
Sure.
minute. If they don't come, I'll just replace them as. I'll just replace them.
Oh, okay. Sure.
We can also call them if you'd like. We're just trying to right now because they're Indian.
Oh yeah. Do that. You can do that, Shaurya.
Yeah, done. They're joining.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Okay,
Okay.
that's good. We'll wait then.
Let's just wait for them then. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm so sorry I'm here.
Hello, it's fine. Before we start, can you introduce yourself as panel? Thank you.
Hi, Sudiksha, share your pronouns. Good luck.
Okay, perfect. We can finally start the open semifinals. So, yeah, with that being said, we have the third motion. So, that is, I cannot see the motions, but yeah, third motion. So, now calling on the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
Okay, I'll be going as the PM. I hope I'm audible. For POIs, you can just put it in the chat. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, majority of the poor people in developing nations don't have houses. They can't afford it because these private investors and private developers have jacked the prices so much. These poor people are then forced to go ahead and live on footpath, sleep on footpath, or anywhere they can find a temporary household whatsoever. And these are the people who never have a permanent shelter over their head and never have surety whatsoever. We think so it's really important then to go ahead and gradually nationalize housing in areas with housing crisis. What does housing crisis areas essentially looks like? One, we think so that areas where the housing is largely unaffordable, majority of the people can't go ahead and afford these housing in general. But second, there's rampant increase in the homelessness rates. Majority of the people don't have an ability to be able to afford house in terms of like renting as well. What does this gradual nationalization essentially look like on our side? One, we think so it doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, and slowly government starts developing and moving towards it. But second, you start going ahead and informing people that you are going ahead and planning towards nationalization, and you go ahead and start working around your plans as government. But third, you also go ahead and develop time for like planning and give time to people to negotiate with you, and like give time to release tenders with like private players so that you can go ahead and contract these ability to build these houses, but also ability to maintain these houses future. Thereby, we think so all the tendering process also goes ahead and happens slowly and gradually over time. But also, you go ahead and take out like time to like attempt to not like relocate people to far off places if you want to go ahead and do so. And even if there might be instances wherein you have to relocate, this is something which is done and planned in advance, like so that people have enough time to go ahead and plan their future as well. But how do you start? You start within the poor areas or areas where the rate of housing crisis is significantly higher. Then you gradually move to areas where middle class people live, and then to rich areas. This is how you go ahead and follow this particular delta. Before that, I'll take POI.
So, presumably, given that you say most of them don't have housing, you can't just have this perfectly gradual kumbaya process of let's do it as slow as possible so everyone can adjust. Which one is it?
They don't have housing because they can't afford it. It's not the problem on supply, and you can do it because you are the government. You have ability to go ahead and make sure that this happens well, and you can expedite the process as well. What is the current harm with respect to housing crisis right now? One, we think so that land is inherently limited in terms of the players who are generally operating within like real estate market at large, primarily because there are large companies who go ahead and operate within like building housing in general in majority of the country. These are the companies who don't go ahead and compete on prices because there are very less number of firms. Insofar as there are only 1 and 2 dominant players in every country who go ahead and dominate the entire real estate market, there is very, very less competition, and there's very high prices that they can go ahead and enjoy because there's less market regulation that generally happens on them. Insofar as that is the case, it becomes really difficult for a vast majority of people to be able to afford housing. But second, we think so the land is limited in terms of the supply of houses that people can largely go ahead and afford, primarily because it's really, really difficult for you to develop majority of the houses because majority of the countries or majority of the areas that we essentially live in have massive overpopulation. And insofar as there's lack of space, and majority of the space have been used for a lot of commercial activity as well, your ability to develop more and more housing gets reduced significantly. But third, we think so there's a lot of hoarding problem that generally happens in vast majority of developing nations that essentially look like people going ahead and buying a lot of houses as a means of investment because they think that real estate is probably going to go ahead and give them return in the future. Insofar as that's the case, case, people go ahead and buy multiple lands and they have multiple properties. At that point in time, there's a lot of like empty housing which never goes to anybody because people are just hoarding it themselves. But fourth, we think so that majority of the poor people come to the urban areas that essentially looks like within Bangladesh, within Japan, going ahead and having concentrated population in big cities like Tokyo or Dhaka. That happens because of massive industrialization and massive commercial activities of these areas being business hub. Insofar as that is the case, there's a heavy concentration of population and overpopulation into certain areas wherein your ability to go ahead and provide housing to everybody gets reduced really, really difficult. But also, majority of the people then, like rich people, live in bigger houses and bungalows. Thereby, it's really difficult for you to be able to expand the ability to give housing to poor people. The impact of this is pretty simple. One, there's rampant homelessness because of this. But second, there's hoarding on the street. But third, that essentially looks like like sanitation facilities, poor facilities for vast majority of the poor people, because they are now hoarding into like smaller houses, large number of people, like 6 to 7 people living in a same house, using the same washroom. All of this worsens of their conditions. That essentially looks like what happens in like Dharavi in India. This is really, really bad for a vast majority of people because it goes ahead and breeds disease. It becomes really difficult for them to go ahead and live a healthy lifestyle and makes it much more prone to diseases at all points in time. But they also have lack of security because if they don't live in a permanent house and they live in like a kacha house in India, like government can come up and just get away or remove your house any day because rich people have an ability to manipulate and lobby the government in terms of making sure that the poor people don't go ahead and live around their houses and they don't have like sanitation issues around the house in general. But second, why private sector is largely inefficient in terms of solving this problem on their side of the house. One, we think so that insofar as private sector sees that there's a housing crisis, instead of responding it to by building like social housing, they responded by going ahead and building houses that can give them massive ROI or that can generate massive returns in general. That essentially means instead of going ahead and building large number of small houses, they build big condos, big mansions, because this is what rich people are going to go ahead and buy. And all of this goes ahead and gives them huge amounts of money or huge amounts of profit because rich people have an ability to go ahead and purchase these things. Insofar as that is the case, we think so that it becomes really, really difficult for them to go ahead and develop any sort of social housing facility whatsoever, because rich people have an ability to like lobby private players as well in terms of them not wanting poor people in terms of like in the area that they live in. They want like a good area which is much more posh. The impact of this argument is pretty simple. One, we think so that in area where you could fit multiple houses and could have multiple people fit in or multiple families fit in, you end up building one large condo, one large mansion, thereby your ability to fit in large number of people gets reduced significantly on their side of the house. But second, why can't go ahead and regulate like price ceiling or rent ceiling if this is what like op wants to go ahead and run as an alternative? One, we think so that it's really difficult for you to go ahead and ensure that on their side of the house by virtue of the fact that a lot of people are going ahead and investing in the real estate sector, thereby they expect some sort of return. Insofar as like you go ahead and put a rent ceiling, the investment also goes down. And insofar as the investment is reduced, we think so the quality of service that they go ahead and provide in terms of housing gets reduced significantly, which is really bad because in terms of natural calamities that just affect like large number of people. But second, we think so that government is much more easier to hold accountable in comparison to these private players who are like going ahead and building housing to generate much and more profit. But third, we think so it's easier for these big players to go ahead and lobby against the government to increase the price ceiling gradually over the years because they also want to go ahead and generate profit and make more money. Thereby, we think so that the only way you can solve this problem is if you go to nationalize. Other alternatives are really bad.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now calling on the Leader of Opposition to begin the clash. Here.
Am I audible?
Hello, yes.
I'll take POS through chat. You can also turn on your camera and just like do that. Okay, open chat. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The nationalization of such a crucial market opens up issues of immense political control and market distrust. 2 things to set up. Firstly, they don't explain what nationalization will look like. We'll explain it. It will likely look like buybacks using billions of dollars either issued as bonds or debt or taken elsewhere through other social services, or straight up expropriation of these things because the government have the money to buy these things. Obviously, secondly, the plan has to be announced, which we will later explain is bad and why the market will adjust immediately, even if it is supposedly done gradually. Second, what's the alternative we'd likely have under our comparative? It's that states already do things like subsidizing property development to inject competition, lowering property tax and lowering land regulations and zoning, offering loans, and even building social housing. Obviously, these things exist to different extents on political capital, which is why some countries don't do them to the massive extent. We would suggest that with the same political capital and the same amount of money that they have through fiat, we would use that instead under our policies. First argument. Why will nationalization, firstly, be done badly, but have negative outcomes on the market and individuals' trust in the government? Firstly, why is it done badly? We'd explain three important characterizations. Firstly, who is likely to experience this nationalization? What types of countries are likely to experience a housing crisis in the first place, right? It's often countries with rigid bureaucracy controlled by the elite, i.e. there's massive red tape, there's massive bureaucracy, places like South Africa, Brazil, the Philippines, even to some extent Canada and the US. And there's a reason why it is the case, where oftentimes the market would itself correct due to economic and market forces with competition and whatnot. The admin itself often is the one causing a lot of these bottlenecks. Secondly, what does this mean for the broad majority of people and when the government does these things? We'd explain that there are massive incentives for the government to just be terrible, and you emphasize these things when you give government all the power to control like housing. I.e., it's that politicians, by nature, irregardless of if democracy is good or if they're currently liberal right now, will have in the future significant patronage incentives, i.e., they get to have immense ability to help supportive populations, or even do things like control dissidents and relocate them. Even things like offering leases to individuals that will own this property in the future are things that you give the government direct power to do when you nationalize them. This is just terrible on scale. If you already can't believe that the government in many of these states doesn't have passionate politics, doesn't prioritize different majoritarian groups based on individual electoral votes. This is just terrible because you probably cannot guarantee that it is equitably done towards the same people that are extremely vulnerable that they explain they want help under their side. Second, it's massive bureaucratic overload. That is, that there are valuations that often take a long time and are very easy for you to overvalue. There's different zoning and valuation issues. There's just a lot of interim for you to be able to study these things that just mean that you cause massive delays and inefficiencies. That is to say, if they are to do it gradually, it would probably take an immense amount of time if they were to do these things. But secondly, even if it was gradual and it did somewhat do these things slowly, there's less of an incentive and capacity to resolve housing quickly, which is why a lot of their benefits of helping people right now, of housing crisis right now, probably isn't necessarily going to be resolved as quickly or as saliently as they try and explain. Secondly, they might say, well, people will be involved. There are many ways we can make this democratic. That in and of itself is a terrible decision. If people are involved, these people also have biases and are likely misaligned and have harmful selfish incentives. I.e., it is you as a rich person who would probably want to prioritize your own property and ability to get these things, and so you expedite it through patronage. It is these people who will probably try and lobby the government because they have more electoral voting power. That meant that minorities, who in many states never had actual electoral power, would probably not be able to access these things like they try and explain. The impact of this is clear. Often, the distribution of this will be predatory, if not predatory, massively inefficient. Second, why will this cause bad outcomes? Before that, I'll take a view, Asher.
Zen, your case is that the government is corrupt, willing to take away any dissidents, and will work with rich people. And then your logic is the government should not do anything and let the private sector deal with it. What is your comparative?
No. So the comparative is, if you can believe that a government has the capacity to do this, it is terrible if you give them massive power to do these things. At the very least, when you make them do things like subsidize properties or whatnot, or inject competition in markets, that lessens their capacity to be pernicious, that lessens their capacity to take advantage of electoral incentives because the natural power they have is towards the market rather than actual people and leasing out these things. Second, why does this actually cause bad outcomes? We'd explain three things. One, it's the chilling effect. I.e., it's developers who develop most of land that now have immediate collapse on their incentives. You just need an announcement for these things to begin fear, right? DMCI or even local developers for things like properties on a mass scale are just unsure how much their benefit or their investments are likely going to scale up in the future. And therefore, it creates a chilling effect on whether or not they want to create these things in the future. But secondly, this also creates capital flight in the asset industry or in the housing industry, right? It's difficult for investors to believe that they should continually invest in making things like property if the government is just going to expropriate or buy back these things at a lower price, to which the government will likely do because they probably don't have enough money nor bond ceilings to be able to reach this amount of debt needed. Secondly, even if you believe that it didn't chill, it is terrible It's because it's gradual that private properties now exponentially increased in price in the interim that these things are slowly being nationalized, which is important because housing is the source of a lot of wealth. It's a lot of assets and generational wealth that's passed down from middle class families that is property. It's thrust into financial insecurity because these people now overload the valuation of private property with the fear that the government will eventually take these things and therefore make it so much harder for people to access housing in the interim of governments nationalizing. Thirdly, at worst, what you get is arbitrary relocations. It is taking homes away from people, which I want to note doesn't mean that the state has to be bad, but it minimizes the risk of if the state will be bad in the future, and that itself is a more certain outcome. Lastly, why are alternatives just much better under our side? The first is that we work within existing housing markets. And I want to note there are many incentives for private corporations and even people who want to do things like capture markets where governments can guide the direction or even control supply, or even access different markets like provide housing control or even developing city centers in rural areas. What this does is it uses these existing private incentives to correct market supply and demand. You fund developers or induce competition to naturally lower prices, which is important because it continues private cooperation and the development of housing. You cannot have one power over the other, and that itself is the problem with the comparative that comes on the government side. Which I want to note, it is a problem of supply. It's a problem of supply of availability in rural areas, of low-cost housing, of competition that should have otherwise drove down pricing, but do not. And so the government needs to induce supply. Secondly, that it expands individual ownership, but also, most importantly, maintains trust in the government. That people clearly will not like this for all the reasons we explained, that it could be used badly, that governments themselves lose trust, that it destroys the market. That means that it's one, hard for people to buy into these things and therefore opt into civic discipline or even democracy, but two, call out the government and believe that it can be changed. All these reasons explained to you, oppose.
Thank you for that speech, Leader of Opposition. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister to begin the extensions of government. Hear, hear.
Robin, are you there?
Yes, hello. Can someone confirm if I'm audible and visible?
Yes to both.
All right. Let me just set up my timer. Okay, this is Robin going BPM. I'll take a POI post 5th. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first argument from side opposition is that this is done badly. The first thing to explain is that if this is true that government is so evil and so corrupt, then the counterprop is even worse. Because then that means that you can't regulate anything. You let private players get away with literally anything. Then you also have no policies about price caps, etc., in the first place. And even if you do, you don't regulate it well, which means all the policy exists as a counterprop is just on paper, but there is no actual mechanism to enforce it in a good way. And private players can literally do massive harms, primarily because they don't care about accountability that much. All they care about profit, and there's no incentive of any sort of social benefit by private players at all. So if their characterization is true, and if this happens in these areas, then the harm on opposition is massive, primarily because then the degree of homelessness actually keeps on increasing significantly, and this is a very bad characterization for op to choose. Second, even if governments are corrupt and often they want to pocket some money, etc., which may be some sort of realistic characterization, we're still okay with that because you still get a lot of benefit in the long term, primarily because even if you give some sort of preferential treatment to the rich people, you're still actually able to create massive benefits, even if governments are corrupt, by virtue of you creating houses, because this happens in two ways. The first is with respect to price, primarily because governments are actually able to lower price significantly once it is nationalized, primarily because governments can operate with losses in the short term for them to get profits in the long term. But secondly, governments also create houses for like a lot of people. This means even if governments do pocket some money in their own pockets, you still get a lot of massive benefits in the long term. But thirdly, even if they are corrupt, it's better to hold the government publicly responsible as opposed to government doing it in the background, primarily because it's quite difficult for you to do it when all government is doing is the regulation and everything is in control of private players, except it is much more easier for you to hold them accountable when this is done publicly, primarily because this is a very big policy at scale. Therefore, the amount of eyes and the amount of media attention for this this is actually at an all-time high. This means even if governments have bad incentives, those incentives change, or oftentimes you can materialize those incentives at a point in time. This policy happens at such a big scale. What are incentives for governments to actually do this good? First is the obvious political incentives, because governments want to get re-elected. The issue is that if you do it badly, then you actually then you actually risk of you not being able to get re-elected. Presumably, this is unique to this motion primarily because when something happens at a very high scale, the amount of eyes is massive. The reason Biden was actually quite unpopular because COVID was a massive event and everybody saw that Biden was not actually able to respond to such a massive thing in a good way. This means because this is a massive thing, this means the amount of political pressure is actually going to be massive. But secondly, governments also have economic incentives. This means if you do it well, you are actually able to generate revenue quite well. Primarily because if you are actually able to generate good housing and are actually able to allow a lot of people to sit there, this actually means that you solve other issues like things like crime, primarily because oftentimes homelessness is linked to crime. This means you're also able to solve a lot of other things which are important for incentives to begin with. But thirdly, they say you can't do it gradually, right? Except no explanation why. We obviously do it gradually and we inform prices and we tell the prices earlier. This means private players just can't jack up prices, primarily because often there's a lot of research and analysis that is done to determine what is the value of these prices. I don't think that governments are stupid, that private players are just going to do whatever they want to. We think obviously do it smartly, but even if ops best case is true that you don't implement it very good, I think there's an ability for it to self-correct in the long term, primarily because this policy has to be envisioned from the long-term perspective, right? Okay, I think the biggest push other than this is that we have better alternatives. Here are 6 structural reasons why those alternatives don't work. The first reason is that it is very difficult for governments to have oversight over things like rent ceilings. Oftentimes, private players exert a lot of dominance and manipulate tenants into paying a higher price above the price ceiling. Oftentimes, complaint process is quite tedious and oftentimes very slow. So most people do not do that. It's tough to regulate each individual house. This means even if governments have good incentives, it is just tough to regulate each individual case as opposed to having an overall regulation, primarily because you can just do it well. But secondly, there is very limited land on site opposition available. So even if governments have good incentive, you just don't have the area to develop social housing at all. But thirdly, often massive lobbying happens, which Lavanya tells you, against governments to keep increasing rent caps. So because the argument is it is often not profitable, this means the alternatives become inefficient. But fourthly, there is a risk of overturn with respect to new governments coming up, primarily because it is not a policy which is consistent. With the new government can simply change the rent cap and maybe increase it to begin with, primarily because the new government favors like the rich people and doesn't want to do a lot of housing for the poor people. This means those policies are also not consistent. This is even harmful. But fifthly, Lavanya told you that quality is very bad once there is a rent ceiling, because now investment does not go for quality, because as a private player you can't generate a lot of revenue in return. But lastly, the rate of population growth and the rate of agglomeration economies, there is the number of people moving from rural areas to urban areas is quite high, and oftentimes this rate is higher than the rate of regulation which you can actually come up with, primarily because these things actually take time, which explains that you just can't do regulation. It takes even more time. All this means that the need metric is quite high. The problem of overpopulation, the problem of agglomeration economies, the problem of homelessness, and the concentration of human capital in metropolitan cities is so massive. This proves the need metric for a very big policy to actually come into place. This will be clearly within the need metric. Before I go for my extension, I'll take a PY.
So I'm not sure who you're responding to. Our counterfactual is not rent ceilings, but encouraging more private actors to enter, because they don't just make condo units for rich people, given that they're only the 1%, but they also make some for the 99%. In fact,
Okay. So all right. So if you have no price controls and then it's quite weak for a counter prop. But secondly, I'm unsure why these incentives work, presumably because the amount of money that a poor person can actually give you is quite less compared to a rich landlord, because condos are actually quite big. That is when places like Bandra, Delhi and Gurgaon, you have these big places to begin with. But secondly, notice oftentimes there's a conflict of interest in housing and also corporate buildings. So oftentimes corporates actually take up that. So it's unclear if those incentives actually work to begin with. That extension. My extension is that why this creates incentives for developers to move to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Why developers don't exist there currently? Because A, ROI is higher in these urban areas, but 2, they already have existing practices here. Now, these metro cities are generally more attractive, but now there's a slow transition to tier 2, tier 3 cities. The margins there are obviously less, but now they have no option left in the metro cities. So all they have to do is operate in a low margin industry in tier 2, tier 3 cities. The impact of this is massive, because it looks like facilities like hospitals, better housing, drastically improving in tier 2 to tier 3 cities. These are places which are left behind. The weighing of this is an independent win condition because now economies get prospered in other areas. Also, lastly, weighing. Home is intrinsic. Home is the biggest need of a human being. When you don't have a home or a land, you have a miserable life. Or during winters, you have to sleep in the cold. There are health diseases primarily because there is no sanitation in the streets. There's a security threat primarily because oftentimes your illegal tents can actually be taken away by the police. Primarily because you live in fear. You live in fear of when my land is going to be taken away. You live in fear when somebody comes in the footpath and kills me because there is no security even for homeless. This means we're actually able to help most number of people on the weighing metric of vulnerability, and because of all those reasons, it's a clear gov ballot. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister. Now calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case of op. Here.
Hello. So, just chat, please. I will take you, one from you, Shaurya, before my 6th minute. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I will do is take out all of the flippant material that comes from DPM. The first thing they explain is that, well, if we say they are corrupt and they are bad, they can't regulate anything under our side. Just use some of your brain, Chair, and explain and identify the actual extents here. On government, we explain a frame that they don't counter, which is a lot of these places often are bureaucratic in nature, often are places in which democracies are subverted all the time by patronage networks. Their side has the state include all of its hand in the pot and to massively stir up the market, do all of these allocations. Why is it better under our side? One, the state can do things that are lower friction and less burden of an intervention because we work within the existing housing markets. So the extent to which corruption can be infused within the solution, it's less. This is common sense. And if you believe anything from the government case, then you're just simply ignoring reality. If we can do these things existingly, we would more prefer the state if it has bad incentives and the capacity to do bad things to be less able to get away with that. But two, under our side, when the interventions are less extreme, the housing market can counterbalance the state because now developers can say some rent controls are bad, some housing ceilings, for example, are bad. In comparison to government, where if they take your property, guess what, guys? You don't have a say in the discussion anymore because you don't have the value and the net worth anymore because they took away your property such that the state is no longer accountable if they indeed overstep on their side of the house. So this nonsense response is nonsense for the reasons that you give common sense to it. Secondly, they say they can keep prices down on their side. I want you to note, firstly, they have given no explanation as to how this process actually fucking happens. One, if it happens through a legitimate process of buybacks, which is what we explained, to no actual mechanization and how it happens on their side, the state spends hundreds of billions when it does this. So obviously then it's likely going to justify having to increase prices afterwards we allocate it because it spends a bunch of money that could have been spent elsewhere. I'm not sure as to why it's going to be massively like, oh, we can keep the costs down. They have to make back the costs some way, guys, and they're probably going to do it through higher prices on people, specifically in urban classes. And if they're talking about they're overpopulated, that is terrible for people who are living on the ground. But two, they don't respond to all of our incentives as to why the prices will likely increase because the reason why housing prices end up going down is if supply increases. But if you kill the supply from developers, which are the predominant builders of housing, not just public social housing, it's often the incentive for prices to go up in general because the housing market's one, tanked, but two, there's just less number of houses such that there's overall less supply to fill in the demand, such as the demand, supply and demand curve, it boosts prices up. There is literal no explanation other than, well, the state can keep costs low. This is not an economic argument. This is just wish-washy. Thirdly, they say there's incentives to do it well on their side. I will kill all of these incentives. One, they say they want to be re-elected. This is a counter reason that we apply under our side far more intuitively. If it's the case they want to be re-elected, they will zone and give it to people that they care about for re-election, like priority groups, like economically advantageous groups, not the minority groups that often make ethnic conflicts or communities around each other at the point where they are not politically prioritized by that state. It's more likely you will listen towards elite people or middle class or the upper middle class people rather than towards the people that you don't actually rely on to get re-elected in the next election. Secondly, they say economic incentives. When has a country like Brazil ever cared so much about economic incentives. Often it does a lot of things like corruption, which are bad for economic incentives. And that's precisely what we explain. If you give the state too much power to intervene in these areas, in the instance where the state has perverse incentives to favor itself better over its own citizens, that's when the economic incentives get skewed terribly for the worst outcomes of the average consumer. And they have no other reasons here. They say it's a bunch of reasons. It's just spam. It's not reasons at all. We explain as to why it's bad incentives. One, they exist within current patronage networks and frames that they have not disputed. Therefore, you have to believe it's true. Two, even citizens themselves don't know the appropriate way to allocate these things. Even if they could tell their politician, well, allocate it somewhere else. One, numbers games means that minorities get disadvantaged, especially the people that aren't likely to be catered to by politicians. But two, just in general, when have you ever trusted citizens to adjust the same things compared to the market, which naturally adjusts it by supply and demand? Citizens often have skewed incentives, like they want to favor themselves or favor their own communities, versus fair allocation, which is why it's likely not going to be fair. Thirdly, they say gradually, therefore, all of our harms, goodbye. One, if it is gradually, this cuts into their benefit of helping people right now, in comparison to all of the things that they scrap that currently exist, which are already hateful people that currently exist, like, for example, building more public social housing, like increasing subsidies and lessening regulations, such as more developers can build, which we are doing immediately under our side, versus theirs, that's a slow process. But two, if it is gradual, that is terrible because now you don't have the actual assurance from people that you will get the house that they need to survive into the long term, which is why they don't get their benefit. The last thing they explain is, well, landlords or investors will, for example, under our side of the house, just control these things in a terrible way. Note, we explain alternatives that are not just rent ceiling. It's things such as price controls, yes, but also as the state doing lower friction, but existing state alternatives, interventions to improve the system. Like, for example, funding more public and social housing, yes, but working with private developers in order to build more of these things, lessening regulation, lessening bureaucracy and red tape. And no, they have counter fiat to do it better under our side of the house. Why is this better? One, they say lobbying. It exists far less under our side because the state is now not the only actor that can control the process in which it happens. Lobbying will happen on either side. It's worse if the state is the only actor that controls the properties and not a 50-50 of public social housing with the market that exists on our side versus theirs. Before that, PY.
You earlier said that there will be capital flight. Are you now suddenly contradicting that claim, or do you think it'll still happen?
Capital flight happens on your side, especially when the state kills all of the property values of these people, when you either, because of your not explained process, expropriate or buy back all of their land for much cheaper. This is hundreds of billions of foreign investor money in your country, and you can't laugh that off, Shaurya. It's often in the money of the money and equity of people who are average homeowners on the ground and minority communities especially. You take that all away without an explanation as to why it is good. Why are alternatives better? One, we actually do things that are lower in the ability for the state to get worse outcomes. It's likely less perverse towards corruption incentives at the point where the housing market can counterbalance because the housing market still exists. Two, we can actually expand supply. And we're the only team in this debate that actually identifies what the reason is. They say land is limited. Only 3% of land is urbanized land. The real cost of the problem is zoning laws and regulation and not having incentives for land developers to expand these things. They don't actually solve the problem. They just reappropriate the scarcity. Under our side of the house, we actually solve the scarcity by working with housing developers, make it so people actually think this is a good policy, not cause massive instability when it's polarizing. It's likely worse for minority communities on the ground. It is very clearly a terrible policy you don't have to bet on. It's worse for these countries for those reasons than opposed.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now calling on the government whip to crystallize the case coming from government. Here.
Hi. Sorry. I'm a little sick. Hello.
Shaurya, एक second.
Okay. While my teammate sends me stuff. I hope I'm clearly audible. I would like. Oh, thanks. Yeah, Robin, I will do that. I hope I'm clearly audible, and I hope that. One second, let me write this down. Yeah. Or please ask me questions like voice wise. I really like voice POIs. Okay. I'll engage with opposition. I won't just call them nonsensical. So, first, let's talk about the idea that this is really difficult for the government to do because the government cannot afford these things and instead it should just reduce taxes. The first thing I want to identify is that reducing taxes and deregulating are debate buzzwords, but they don't relate to anything Lavanya or Robin said, which is that it's very difficult for you to provide more housing when, first of all, there is no incentive for you to provide cheap housing to people who are poorer. The implication of this is that reduced taxes and deregulation simply reduces the cost of building something. But if you can make more money by simply selling it to middle class and upper class people, you will continue making luxury condos and not actually making housing for the poor. The only response to this opposition has is that if we reduce the cost, we'll be able to afford selling it to the poor. What does a housing crisis mean, panel? It means there are too many people who want houses. What does this look like? Generally, it looks like large major metropolitan cities where there's so many businesses and companies that everyone wants to live there. There is no reason for you to provide this to a poor person. You literally won't make a profit. In fact, if you reduce taxes and deregulate, which by the way is not just zoning laws, it's also the quality of the provisions that you provide. For example, is your building safe? Is your building actually healthy enough that it doesn't have fucking asbestos peeling off the walls like my building does, by the way, right next to me right now? And as a result, people get sick. Then it leads to two outcomes. First, more money and capability for lobbying, which worsens every single harm on opposition because now these companies get even more power. Second of all, the quality of housing gets much worse even if they do build it for poor people because they don't have to run it very well. Third, they have given zero responses to all of our mechs, which I'm sure opposition whip will make fun of but won't respond to. Our mechs, first, competition is low because it's a barrier to entry. It's difficult for you to compete because not everyone can buy land and land itself is restricted. They claim the problem is zoning laws and regulations. But panel, if there's a housing crisis and there's a government that wants houses, presumably in the decades that the housing crisis was building up, as people did not have houses, if the problem was just let's open up some more land, they would have done it. The reason is there is literally no political cost to opening up more land when you can have your buddies who apparently, according to opposition, are the elites and developers, go in, make houses and make money. The realistic interpretation that you should have as a panel, especially because this is the places where the debate is most salient, are places like Mumbai, where you literally run out of land. You have a coastline, so you cannot just keep expanding into the ocean. You live in Delhi, where there's so many other states where you cannot just build houses 5 hours away from commute. You live in New York, Vancouver, Tokyo, every actual country in the real world which has a housing crisis, which isn't a problem of zoning laws. That means that the main implication of everything here is that the state being able to unafford it and the supply falling and all that makes very little sense. The final thing they say is you can't afford this because it's so expensive, but they just said this capital flight. And that's the thing we're very happy to accept. Investors will leave, and that means the prices of the housing will go down, and that means the government can buy it at a cheap cost. The reason we're okay with this is because the investment wasn't creating any supply. It was creating supply for rich people, and it was artificially raising the price of these houses, which is why people buy it to hold it as a property value, which keeps going up. That's the money they're making, not renting. What do? First, we tell you how we do this. Just because opposition doesn't understand it doesn't mean Lavanya didn't fucking speak. She has a mouth, words came out. What were those words? You go to a poor area and you buy the houses there. That, according to opposition, freaks out the market, and all the rich and middle class areas, the prices fall. What does op say? In the interim, the prices skyrocket. Why? The price is a reflection of future value. If the houses they will be taken over by the government eventually, presumably the price falls. So as we buy cheaper housing and provide the housing that we need to provide to the poorest people in that city, other places become cheaper over time. So it becomes easier for the government to buy them. All of this gives you the conclusion that obviously the government can afford this and there is no other way to regulate this and opposition has no alternative. This means that even if the government is quite corrupt, we are winning clearly. The first reason for this is that the government is still better than the private sector and the government collaborating corruptly. Why is this the case? First, the government might be bad, but it has to focus on numbers. That means that it has to focus on the amount of voters it needs. According to OP, that means it won't care about minorities. Okay, we'll trade off the minority. OP has to trade off the majority. Why is that the case? Because the voters who are the majority tend to be the people who are poorer or middle class and like lower middle class, working class people in these cities who need to put and like cast their ballot. So often governments have to at least be more accessible to people who are poorer than the private sector, which explicitly focuses on price. So on scale, we help a lot more people. There is rampant homelessness in places like Mumbai and Delhi, and now we create houses for millions more people over time, even if this is only 2 to 3% of the national budget of all these areas, that's a lot of people who are no longer living on the street, who are no longer getting no fucking space to save themselves when it's winter and they're freezing to death, who are not committing crimes and creating instability in the area because they are sick and desperate for medicine, and so they're willing to break into pharmacies and go and fight people for money, all of which makes it difficult for the areas to grow. That by itself wins the impact. But second, on intensity, even if somehow opposition made more private supply of housing, the point is that the people who would be able to buy that housing would be people who would have been able to pay rent from the private prices. So those people could have gone to other cities or could have gone to cheaper places which they would have been able to afford on both sides of the debate. So the vulnerability of our stakeholder obviously outweighs that of the stakeholder on opposition. But third, the absolute worst harm is that the government is corrupt, but they have no solution to that harm. And that's why we flip their politics claim before that, opposition.
Your entire case is reliant on supply just being static and can never be changed because I guess these things exist. Johannesburg and Manila are low density in nature. A lot of it is because some places are deemed to be more politically important, therefore zoning. That you've given no reason as to why they can't just expand and therefore there's no land at all.
If they're politically important, hence their zoning, then the excuse is that this place needs to be kept away from private sector, so there's no supply there. If you then nationalize it, then the place will be kept away from the private sector, there's no supply there. There's no difference. Taking away zoning laws on your side would either use the same political capital to then let there be housing that we can use to create housing there as well, or your side would just have a much harder battle to fight trying to open up these areas. So we don't think it's a big difference. Second, we don't think that's the majority of places for the structural analysis we gave you. For all the panel knows, I don't know how much you know, Annika, but you don't know this is true. Average intelligent voter doesn't believe random examples. They believe analysis, which we provided you. Finally, look, on politics, they say you hurt dissidents, you slow these things down because rich people have bad incentives, and now you need a counter check from the private industry. First, we have no clue what the counter check is. What is the private industry doing other than supporting the government, exploiting people? But second, if the government is so bad, we solve the problem. It is physically visible now that the government is responsible for all housing. Only the government, not the private sector. So you don't try to earn money or beg the government to regulate the private sector and watch you continuously fail. You see that the only pathway to a better life is to force the government to change, which like roots out corruption and makes it a lot less rampant. It takes away lobbyists who are running away to other places. It makes it easier for you to make housing accessible. We do not think the solution to a housing crisis is to do nothing and accept the fucking private sector, which has failed for the past few centuries. We think it's time for the government to take up some fucking responsibility.
Thank you for that speech, Government Whip. Now calling on the Opposition Whip to crystallize the case on opposition. Here.
No. Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Nice. I'll start my speech on my first word. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So this government team sets an incredibly high burden on themselves, where they are reliant on the characterization that this issue on housing isn't a supply issue, as per PM. But think about the context of areas with housing crises. DPM concedes that these areas often experience rapid population growth, which suggests that even if we believe that the current housing market is capable of accommodating citizens, it's unclear how the state will fare in 20 years when the population doubles, which is why, absent a mechanism to be able to increase the supply, what happens under their side is that in 20 years, the people who have rent and who have these things at such low values due to the government perhaps live a happy life. But the rest of the population, because the government refused to give them and allowed for development to happen in the first place to increase the amount of the housing supply, means that they're left in the dust. Because note, this is not a debate about whether or not the government should provide public or subsidized housing. In fact, for the poorest of individuals, which make up less than the middle class population within the vast majority of these areas, these are still likely to be good alternatives for them. The problem is the government's capabilities in terms of being able to build is either already limited or limited even further when they have to spend exponentially more and apparently not profit off of it when they spend billions on buybacks on these sorts of properties. So it's actually on their side where they get less affordable housing in the first place and less public and subsidized housing because the government's funds are drained by the buyback that is happening, and you waste more money into the economy that will never go back to you because you refuse to charge them. This is a ticking time bomb that may work in the first 5 years, but fucks over everybody in the next 50. Why is this likely? For all of the reasons they illustrate on short-term election cycles, the fact that the effects of this policy likely won't reach your political party and the current status and the current cycle, and will likely have to be a problem that is dealt with in the future, means that these things are bad. Through the counterfactual we posit, we're able to build more things by virtue of increasing the amount of developers within an area. Their response is to say, well, competition is impossible because of a high barrier to entry. One, we lower the barrier of entry to such things through our policy. Like, this is the fucking point. Reducing property taxes, public-private partnerships that ensure that the government is able to spend less but still gain the final end impact of ensuring that buildings are built in the first place. Second, often there are multiple developers. Look to Manila, for example, where there's DMCI, SMDC, and multiple developers who are vying for those lots. And they say there is no incentive to build poor person housing and things that they can afford. But what I'd point out is that their mechanism to solve this is that prices fall when people expect that these things will be expropriated. But note that the prices will still be high and this will rebound because there's similar competition and massive aggressive competition that exists for this sort of housing when individuals are able to interact in that way and therefore be able to skyrocket it because lots of people want the same piece of land. And therefore, their mechanisms of solving and ensuring free housing, or at the very least housing that is accessible, is still reliant on a mechanism that they are yet to explain. The second thing that I want to talk about is corruption. And note their flippant attempt to try and wash this claim by saying, well, corruption will happen on either side of the debate, and therefore a lot of what happens is either at moot or like based on the argument that Shaurya built in his whip speech, something that can be fixed because people will suddenly grow a pair and apparently protest against the government. First off, I want you to note how idealistic this fix to corruption is under their side. It's unclear to what extent we're able to fix corruption. How do you change it, and why is it at the very least better on our comparative? The first is the government has less of a hand with regard to how these things happen. If you cannot trust the government to operate these things, if they are corrupt in the vast majority of instances and have stalled bureaucracy, then it's obviously on our side where they don't have a sole hold over these things and where they can't unilaterally make decisions on behalf of the people, that they're likely to make better decisions. The second thing that I'd note is that even if governments are corrupt on our comparative, the way in which they enact these things are oftentimes far worse for the average person. And the reason why is corruption, at the very least on our comparative, is considered and is at the very least going to be able to be prevented by the amount of placing that the government has within the issue. But the way in which we're able to short and like drive down property prices in the first place is through doing a whole sorts of things. One, through the competition mechanism, because individuals and want to diversify beyond just catering to rich people since they make up a relatively small amount of the population, means that they create affordable housing for the average person, such as what's currently happening in many different cities across the world. Facts don't become non-facts just because you have structural reasons that we already responded to. Before I go on, sure, Shaurya.
So we didn't just say that there's no supply. We said that rich developers want to build for rich people. And if they build for a poor person, the value of that land reduces and hoarding a price is a lot easier than building more property. All of this still requires you to prove to me how people can afford land and building an entire building to compete in the market as well. A response you still haven't given.
One, because there are a limited amount of rich people within these areas. What that means is that when you build 2 condos to cater for the rich people to buy, then that means that if you want to diversify and if you want to expand your own property, since property is in itself a good thing, then you expand and build affordable housing for the average person. Second, it's actually through our competition mechanism where these things get easier. Because when you have multiple developers vying for things, and when you subsidize more developers to come in instead of scaring them away, because note, capital flight doesn't exist for investors, it exists for the developers who want to create something, which means that prices will still remain relatively high even on your comparative. Third, let's assume that you do have individuals who are able to afford housing on your comparative. I don't believe that because it is still reliant on the government policing these things or short-term rebounding effects that rely on very erratic market behavior that is likely to self-correct over time. What we explain is that you still have a problem of ensuring that this housing crisis even happens in the first place. And your response at DPM was to say, well, it's better because capital flight means they go to poorer areas and therefore develop those areas instead, when you ignore the existing housing crises and all of the people that are suffering on your side. If you think that it's bad to live in a building that's already bad, it's bad to live and to not be able to live in a building at all. And that's what happens on your side when you massively chill the effect, because people just expect that their land and all of the property and the development that they created is going to be mitigated in the first place. The last thing I want to talk about. Why is it the case that even in our worst case, where it is about rent control, it is about all of these things, why do we still win on face? The first thing I'd note is that since they give no reason to explain why this caters to the long term, and a lot of the political impacts are able to be mitigated on our side and have less of an effect on how we can make affordable housing for individuals, then it's obviously the case that you have to default on our side, where you have to rely less on the mechanism of governments actually doing shit, because they say governments should grow a pair. They've tried to grow a pair for the past 50 years, and suddenly this policy is going to change it. I don't think so. In short, they're incredibly idealistic, and it's for these reasons that you have to side with opposition.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech. Now calling on the reply, starting with Op reply. Here.
What is wrong with my camera? Sorry, give me a sec. Okay, there. Okay. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What is reality and how do we navigate the real world? The first thing I want to assess is the issue of bad governments versus good governments. They say, well, if we explain that the government is bad, the government will do nothing if the government's bad. The weighing of this argument and how you should perceive it as a judge is not if our side is good and has a good government and if theirs is bad. It is when either side has selfish incentives like electoral incentives or profit maximization incentives that you have by skewing to one or the other one leaves one to be unchecked and the levers of power tilt against minorities. And their own frame supports this. They say corporations have, when unchecked, been bad, which is presumably the same with the government when they all have the same electoral incentives to appeal to specific demographics of people. The way you should weigh this then is with risk. They risk immense control and skewed power when bad governments come up. Even if, under our side, the government is bad, corporations still at the very least produce housing, don't have immense capital flight and housing asset crashes, many obviously can't recover from. The next thing they say is, well, they provide massive housing for people. The way we explained prior already explains why this isn't true and tends towards inequality. In fact, we flip this. It's assets like housing that are particularly sensitive for people. It's the idea that it's yours forever, that it maintains its value, which is crucial for things like loans, escaping poverty, building long-term wealth, which is often what middle-class workers use to pay off 30-year mortgage, or it's what affects these individuals. You removing this destroys the market and opportunities for people, even if it is fixed in the future. The problem is that it is immense loss for the average person. What assets do they have now when it's taken away from them? How are they supposed to build up long-term wealth when they just were able to pay off their mortgage? All of these issues are never actually assessed, and they say, we'll just give this to poor people. The issue is the people you take that property from and how they could possibly cope with these things. The next thing they say is, well, we only build for rich people, and so building for the poor lowers the value. And this is now assessing the actual reality of things like pricing and how we're able to resolve these issues. The first is, the reality is that rich people and the demographic of that is limited. And that's why we had recent expansions towards things like rural areas and developments, right? It looks like Greater Manila, it looks like rural urban center projects, or even just the incentives for lower or middle class appealing types of rent within certain zoning areas that meant that you at the very least give these opportunities for people in the instances when the demographic is very saturated, like in New York City, which is why they've expanded. I.e., and I want to note, this expedited with government help, which only exists when the market is believed in and private people still have an incentive to profit from these things. What you do is you lessen the quality and likelihood for private corporations to begin developing land because now there's no incentive for it. The government will take it anyways. The government will profit from these things anyways. So any meaningful investment that you have into developing these types of things is either stalled, not continued, or just not begun in the first place. Secondly, how do we actually solve the housing issue in the long term? And we want to explain the counterfactual, right? We've explained from the three past speakers that the government decides to intervene and try to resolve crises with something that's not nationalization. And it looks like a couple of things. You either, one, subsidize housing with low rent rates and inject them in high-cost areas, like what Canada did before Trudeau, or you do things like reduce property taxes, fix zoning laws, or use the market forces. The response they have is, well, this will lower pricing in poor areas because housing value disappears, which we explain will maybe happen, but far into the future. We explain what happens, therefore, in the interim. Government makes an announcement. Supply stops and is therefore stalled. Pricing increases because people still need houses, but there's no supply increase. And the intuition for why this happens is real. I live in a house, the government buys my house. They then kick me out and give it to someone who needs it more. Where do I go? What do I do as a person? I have money, but I can't buy or rent because, like they say, there's no supply. People already took all of the space, and thus prices for rent increase, and now I'm left homeless. All that's to say that the intuition itself explains the cycle. You worsen the problem, and that's how the bubble bursts. Housing is worse. It's immensely overvalued. You have capital flight, which means little actual development. And the same people that you took housing from that maybe were more financially stable become financially unstable because now there's no housing they can actually buy. What you do is you worsen the housing market. It's worse for people on the ground and never actually helped the poor person because only relocated the problem towards different demographics. All that's to say, it's terrible.
Thank you for that op reply. Now calling on Gov reply to end the debate. Here.
Hello. Can someone confirm if I'm audible and visible?
Yes to both.
All right. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ops case only works in a world where no poor people are migrating to urban areas, where we live in a world of Minecraft, where we can just invent new land with a click of a button, where all rich people don't want big houses and hoarding doesn't happen at all, but are Buddhists, so are satisfied with a 2 BHK and a simple life, where homelessness is not a problem at all. Unfortunately, that is not the world we live in. The first argument they come up with, that is corruption and inefficiency. Let's assume every word they say is true. We still win because this is mitigation at best. Because corruption implies that you don't get the actual end benefit you intended, but you still get a lot of benefit. So non-corrupt government would help millions of people. A corrupt government will help millions minus 10,000 people because they would take the money of those 10,000 people into their own pockets. So you still help a lot of people. Except there are 3 deadlock breakers why we clearly win the corruption clash. A, we explain if governments are corrupt, the counterprop is even worse and no one is actually helped because you can't actually regulate at all. And even if you regulate, it is just on paper. They say it can be prevented. But the second deadlock breaker responds to that. Accountability is much more easier when government does something so big because the amount of media scrutiny is so high, which I said in my speech, and we receive no response to. Because the comparative is regulation where things happen behind closed doors with private negotiation with private players, which means it is so difficult for you to actually have any accountability. But thirdly, we explain there is an ability to self-correct in the long term. So the harm of corruption is only temporary. So this is not a policy which can be reversed, right? So in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it keeps getting better. So because you can identify problems of allocation, you can identify problems of quality. This happens with every government policy, by the way. Anything which government does will come up with corruption, but you self-correct as and as governments get better. So by that logic, no particular government should do any policy because there is corruption to begin with, right? The second argument they have is the economical argument. You cannot afford it. Well, have you heard of something called debt? Debt is quite easy to finance these things. It is easy to get because it's not a risky project because you have massive demand. So it's not like you're creating ghost cities because we already explained it's a massive demand because it's a housing crisis. But secondly, you can issue bonds which are also very attractive. But thirdly, Shaurya explains to you prices go down because it is for certain that the land will be taken away. So it's unclear whether prices will go up because it is counterintuitive. So notice that this proves that you can afford it. You also explain that governments have capacity to take short-term losses for long-term gains because they have a bigger capacity relative to corporates. So even if they recoup money in the long term from rent, we think we're okay with that. But the weighing of this is that economics don't even really matter because this is a very big security need of people and should be done for social good. So it's unclear why government is just doing this for an ROI perspective. So they never explain why that is should be the core incentive of this debate to begin with. So that argument is also not relevant. But lastly, let's talk about alternatives, right? So I give you extensive analysis why alternatives don't work, why regulation don't work. Their only response is that, oh, it's a supply problem. But Shaurya explains to you, if it is a supply problem based off investment, which means housing crisis is the result of no investment being there, then why is there a housing crisis even in the first place? Because if there is a big demand, then obviously you can fulfill the demand and earn money off it. This means, had it been a supply problem, there would have been no housing crisis, because you would have solved the problem ages ago when the housing crisis did not even start, because you obviously have profit incentives. We explain it is an issue of overhoarding of property. It is an issue of not having enough land. It is an issue of overpopulation. It is an issue of agglomeration economies and concentration of human capital in metropolitan cities like Mumbai, like all these places, etc., etc. This means we clearly win on that. They have still given you no analysis with respect to why firms build houses for the poor on their side. Why are they an attractive investment when you can get a better ROI for building big corporates for big corporates and huge ass houses? And they never explain if the scale is enough to deal with the current issues that actually exist today. Here are three win-win conditions for side government. A, on vulnerability, we explain that people cannot afford high prices, and literally because there is no space. We explain that the problem of homelessness is actually so high because it is the biggest security need of people, and we ought to protect those people. Secondly, on scale, we help more people because we create high density housing, and we just remove those bungalows, which means so many people can be accumulated. By the way, corporates also like this because they have more labor, by the way, right? But thirdly, on long term, we will make money from rent, but on opposition, you make extreme profits because of hoarding to begin with, right? We think that is bad. Oftentimes, things can be inefficient because of governments are corrupt. That does not stop us from change. That does not stop us from help the poor. We think nationalization is the only way with which we can help so many people, and that is why I think we are clearly winning this debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that speech, government reply. That concludes the open semifinals round. Thank you guys for the debate. For my panelists, let's go to breakout room